Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Ian Huyett, attorney for Cornerstone. Cornerstone is New Hampshire's only full-time Christian advocacy organization. We represent over 100 churches around the state, so I hope I can help resolve some confusion. This bill, in its as introduced form, we supported, and it is currently close in its wording to something that we would endorse. And we also agreed to a number of compromises in the Senate that would have pushed it over the line into something that we could support. And I hope that we can resolve that in this committee. I will say one thing I really appreciated about Senator Lang's testimony is he clearly articulated that when churches are engaged in activity to support their communities, that is not somehow a secular or a non-religious activity. That's part of the core essence of Christianity for 2,000 years. And although we are only a Christian organization, when it comes to issues of tax assessments and zoning, we typically also are aligned with smaller non-Christian organizations and denominations around the state, as we were when we supported the passage of 674-76. In now Governor Ayotte's stated policies during her campaign, she campaigned on, as part of her written housing plan, one way that we should increase the housing supply in the state is by enabling and encouraging churches to provide more housing. And that was part of the original intent of this bill, and it's a part of the intent of the bill that we support. And we think there's a democratic mandate for enabling churches to contribute to the housing supply. Now, that involves kind of two aspects that are implied in this bill. One is removing negative obstacles that are incapacitating churches from providing housing and other community services. And then one is providing some positive incentive or encouragement for churches to contribute to the housing supply. Now, on the first facet, removing negative obstacles, our churches around the state are running up against increasingly enterprising or aggressive or discriminatory tax assessors and zoning authorities. Churches have always had problems in this area, but we're hearing all over the state that tax assessors in particular are getting more and more enterprising in what they try to count as a secular or a non-religious use. The attorney from Concord stated that tax assessors are giving churches the benefit of the doubt in the area of tax assessment. I don't think I've talked to a single pastor of any kind of Christian denomination anywhere in the state that has said to me, I'm being given the benefit of the doubt. What we're seeing is assessors are trying to tax the grass around the chapel building as a non-religious use. They're trying to tax the outbuildings that are on the same lot but aren't part of the chapel, as that's somehow non-religious or secular. Churches have property on their church lot that they're using for community-oriented programs to give back to their town. That's being assessed as non-religious. And so the result is many of our most enterprising churches in the state, the churches that would like to do things like contribute to the housing supply, are being incapacitated by getting tied up in litigation or disputes around tax assessments or zoning, such that, for example, one of our best, most model churches in the state, Crossing Life in Windham, had a school for a couple of years that educated 100-some people, including dozens of people in the community that were there on scholarships. So Crossing Life was saving the town, not getting a subsidy from the town, but saving the town thousands, tens of thousands of dollars in per pupil cost. And they had to close that because of the expense of dealing with assessments and zoning issues from the town, which was getting increasingly aggressive. And then, of course, we have part of the reason that 674-76 exists is that we have some towns that have denied all construction of or by churches for 50, 60 years. Now, on the affirmative incentives issue, this is where the 6-unit limitation comes in. This originally had no 6-unit limitation, and we would certainly like to see no limitation. We don't think there needs to be one, but we tried to, on behalf of our churches, negotiate a number of compromises that would at least substantially move the ball forward. 6 is just too low for us to see any of our churches really make any substantial contribution towards housing. You're not going to see any churches say it's time to step up and provide some more housing with a 6-unit limitation. If it was substantially higher, you would frankly only see a handful of churches, but they're some of the most enterprising entrepreneurial churches. And this is the last point I'll make, these are the kinds of churches that want to reinvest in their communities. The kinds of churches that will provide housing under this bill are churches that are going to give back to their communities with schools, with other community-oriented programs, such that these communities are going to receive a net benefit. And that's why these churches should not be compared to purely commercial landlords, which will just keep the money and will not reinvest that money in their communities. And I'd be happy to take any legal questions about this bill, the as introduced bill, the history of the bill, or any of the text here.
Thank you very much. Before I take questions from the committee, is it your contention that if that 6 number was released, someone like the Salvation Army could establish a homeless shelter, providing either temporary or long-term TANF type housing, and do that without a tax burden for the structure in which families are living as they get reorganized? Is that the position of Cornerstone?
That would certainly be part of what would be included in this bill. And I want to draw your attention to something that the attorney from Concord noted, which is in response to a similar question from you, Mr. Chairman, she said something to the effect of that church should set up a 501c3, and then under an earlier tax exemption in RSA 72, then that property would be totally tax exempt. And what I want to emphasize is I think that actually underscores that our current law, or a really restrictive limitation like a 6-unit limitation, is discriminatory towards churches, because what is being said there is in effect a regular old nonprofit. If it was providing housing as part of the mission of the nonprofit under an earlier provision in RSA 72, that would be totally tax exempt. But if a church provides that service as a church, that's somehow not going to be tax exempt because a church is the service providing it. So churches are right now being treated different and more harshly than other non-church nonprofits. We think that's unconstitutional, and there's a compelling litigation case there, especially under New Hampshire state law. But we hope we can at least substantially move the ball forward with a bill like this one.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the committee? Representative Almy.
Yes. If I'm doing several things with my property and they require separate permits, which is what you're claiming, I think you're getting into an area where a permit for increasing housing is different from a permit for a church, which is on trying to increase housing. But a church is one thing, increasing housing is another thing, even if you regard it as a religious obligation. A land trust regards it as a different kind of obligation, which is to take care of the poor without regard to religion. So you really think that churches should automatically have the same, it wouldn't even be the same classification, because I believe that my land trust has to pay property tax on buildings that we build.
Well,
Maybe she should find out.
Representative, thank you for your question. Just to clarify, we are not saying that there shouldn't be any hurdles that churches should have to jump through if they construct housing on their lot. They would still have to comply with all of the zoning hurdles listed here in lines 72 through 24. And in fact, we're adding an additional hurdle here by pointing to, compliance with the sewage system. Now, part of the reason compliance with the sewage system is in here is that a principal talking point from municipalities that are anti-church construction is, well, under this current RSA 674-76, which was enacted last session, now there's difficulties with sewage, so we just want to take that talking point off the table and concede churches need to be required to comply with the same sewage requirements as secular entities. But the reason that this RSA is here is Mr. Deshays from the Municipal Association said, well, the other requirements under zoning are reasonable, there are municipalities in the state that have denied every single, not just housing, but everything, every single thing any church in their town has tried to construct for many, many decades, 50, 60 years, and they always find some different excuse. So the question I would ask as far as Section 76 is it reasonable to deny absolutely anything that any church wants to construct in your town for a long time? I think the alternative is we enumerate a specific list of requirements to ensure they do have to comply with zoning requirements, but they're enumerated and they're clear, like in these lines 17 through 25.
Representative Orrs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for taking my question. So have you ever heard of the region, Myanmar?
I have
Recently
yeah.
suffered an earthquake. Yes. So there's a group called EP4, and they're building religious, let me rephrase that. They're building houses and feeding the poor in that region. Would you consider that to be a non-religious outreach because they're building houses for the poor as well as feeding them? Or how does that align with what you're telling us, that by building houses for the poor, we're helping the poor?
I think that's absolutely correct. Christians have always understood that to be a core part of their mission since the institutional church has existed for 2,000 years. Christians have always run community-oriented programs to serve the poor and to serve people in need. And the kinds of churches that will provide housing under this bill are the same kinds of churches that run housing for people recovering from drug addiction, that run housing for unwed mothers, that provide schools, that provide programs to provide educational services to children in their community. Every single church that's going to take advantage of this to build housing is a church that gives back to their community substantially and therefore wouldn't be receiving any subsidy.
Follow up?
Go ahead.
So as a born-again, spirit-filled Christian, though I am not a member of any church or fellowship community, I know the local Chichester Church. My constituents there provide food for the children, which I understand the food served in the cafeteria there often is unedible. Would you consider that a religious activity, providing food to the children of that school?
I absolutely would. A religious and a traditionally Christian activity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a general comment. One of my minors in school was comparative religion. It's not just a Christian. If you take a look at Islam, if you take a look at Judaism, if you take a look at Buddhism, Hinduism, even Shintoism, care for the poor, care for your neighbor is a core principle of almost all religions. But that's neither here nor there. Just adding to the point. Any other questions from the committee? Yes, Representative Elbert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When your churches are providing schooling, I assume that the schooling is religion-based.
Yes, correct.
Thank you.
Representative Opal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one quick question, Mr. Huyett, and you've raised some interesting points. I'm wondering, and I'm not proposing to do this, but I'm wondering how Cornerstone would feel if an amendment were offered that said you can build housing, 6 units or 106 units, but that the rental rate on those would be limited below market rate based on the tax exemption you might receive. Some sort of law that says you can cap the price here.
Yeah.
How would you feel about that?
Thank you for your question. Actually, part of what you're describing is you're describing the as introduced bill. As introduced, this bill actually said that the rent would have to correspond to state statutory workforce housing rent, which is something like needs to be affordable to someone with the median income for a 3-person household in the community. There is a state RSA that defines workforce housing rent. So that the requirement there would have made sure that any rent of any of these properties would have been essentially below market rate. So churches have something of a handicap in terms of what rent they could provide in order to fall under these protections. Now, we would ideally
Yeah, we're getting into,
One more sentence, Mr. Chair.
go ahead, sir.
I would just say we would ideally like to see no limit, but that was something that we supported as part of an attempt to broker a bipartisan compromise to move the ball forward.